64 years ago, in 1959, BMC launched the Mini. Undoubtedly the best known car ever to have come out of Great Britain. Not only was it a brilliant car, but it constituted a revolution in car design, Alec Issigonis masterminding the formula for the modern car. But newsflash, the Mini was never the best-selling car in Britain, because for the bulk of the 1960s, that title went to its big brother. So today on TwinCam, one of the greatest family cars ever built, the 1100. Over the past few years, you and I have been lucky enough to meet many of the heroes and villains of motoring history, but no company has such a checkered profile as the British Motor Corporation. BMC was the result of a merger between Britain's traditional motoring giants, Austin and Morris, in 1952. The two manufacturers brought with them an array of marques and models, but as the end of the decade neared, the need for an all-new range of cars became apparent. At the helm of design and engineering was a genius named Alec Issigonis, and the motor industry would never be the same again. The first and smallest of Issigonis' babies was ADO 15, the car we all know as the Mini, probably the most influential car of all time. But there's a lot more where that came from. Last year we had the pleasure of studying ADO 17, the car colloquially known as the Land Crab, and back in 1964 it ought to have been a world beater. But due to stubbornness and a lack of market understanding, the third piece in their puzzle collapsed to the ground. However, between 15 and 17 we have what may just be the sweet spot, 1962's ADO 16. But before we dive in, let's take a minute and get ourselves some context, because at the turn of the decade, BMC was a complicated place. Our baseline is of course the 850cc Mini, but on the rung above they were building two separate cars, the Austin A40 and Morris Minor, both using a 950cc version of the same A-series engine as the Mini. However, the next models up were the mid-range Farina saloons, displacing 1500cc, leaving a nice gap for ADO 16 to sit in as a small family car. And with the Mini's pedigree to build upon, its development was swift and trouble-free. In fact, the only difference from ADO 15 was the level of oversight, as the Mini's development was accelerated by world events, leaving Issigonis with free rein over the entire project. In contrast, ADO 16 would take a more considered approach. If you're nerdy like me and are interested in the Mini's development, then I'll put a card up in the corner. But Issigonis had such control that, despite being an engineer, he styled the car himself. Now, in 2023, we see the Mini as a design classic, but in 1959, people weren't quite so sure, so it's no surprise that its big brother was styled by none other than Pininfarina. Pininfarina are one of the great Italian styling houses, responsible for many a gorgeous supercar, but in the 50s and 60s they styled many of BMC's cars, including the obviously named Farina saloons, as well as the A40 I mentioned earlier. Therefore, it's no surprise they were consulted for ADO 16, and the shape they came up with was characteristically gorgeous. Working with Issigonis can't have been easy, and we'll get to that soon, as I'm sure the Italians were given a strict set of dimensions to work with, but they nailed it. It toes the line between being conservative enough to appeal to everyone and being characterful enough to be unique. It bears resemblance to many a period BMC car, including the MGB, but it appears to have had a market versatility few competitors could match. It's styled just as at home on this two-tone Wolseley 1100 as it was a racy Austin 1300 GT. We'll get to the badging later on though, so for now, back to engineering. But first, a caveat. It's easy for us to forget today that the Mini wasn't a normal new car. It was designed to make microcars redundant, and it succeeded. But it did so through phenomenal packaging. Issigonis and his team only managed to fit 4 seats, a proper engine and a decent boot into 10 feet of Mini by ripping up the rulebook and starting again. The most famous change Issigonis made was to take the accepted longitudinal engine layout and turn it through 90 degrees, fitting a clutch to the side, a gearbox to the bottom, and making ADO 15 front-wheel drive. Now, front drive was absolutely nothing new, but nobody before had done it with such finesse while retaining a 4-cylinder engine, and it was only 4 years before BMC were copied by Fiat, who debuted the Auto Bianchi Primula with the improvement of an on-end gearbox. However, it would be well into the following decade before it truly became the industry standard, and that meant the Mini and 1100 were in a class of their own. Curiously, however, a transverse engine wasn't always on the cards for ADO 16. It's well known that Issigonis had a thing for Lancia, and BMC began developing their own narrow-angle V4. However, they quickly realised that a transverse 4-cylinder was more space efficient, so if you ever wondered why an 1100's engine bay is just that bit bigger than you might expect, well, now you know. But back to the point, and from the images you've all just been seeing, I'd expect you to be able to recognise this as an A-series, the little 4-banger that sustained its maker all the way through to the turn of the millennium. On paper, it's a simple Siamese port overhead valve cast iron lump, but through its life it became known as one of the hardiest and most tunable small engines ever made. In '61, it was bought out to just under a litre for the legendary Mini Cooper, and a year later, it carried a lot of that pedigree over to the stroked out 1100. To be exact, we're talking 1098cc, and previously the A-Series had been a proper low-powered sugar of an engine, yet the Mini Cooper's cylinder head, allied to the boring and stroking out to bring it to 1100, started to turn it into a bit of a weapon. The larger inlet valves mean 48 brake horsepower and 60 pound-feet of torque, and while that's not an awful lot, it is respectable for 1962. And also, those figures are produced really down low in the range. The torque at 2,500, which makes this engine feel so willing. It just feels like a workaholic that is so happy to chug along and to bring you up to your respectable cruising speed. It just pulls so nicely. Rev matching is so easy, but it is just so torquey. And so I'm coming up this hill now in a car that usually would need well over 3,000 revs to get to. And I'm probably just on the cusp of 3,000 revs right there. It doesn't really want to do much more than that, and that makes it such an easy car to drive. I love the noise it makes. It's such a growly, grumbly little engine. And although it's not got that much power, it's just so nice in a car like this that weighs, I'm not quite sure to be honest, 700 kilos maybe? It's more than enough to just feel so happy on the roads. And best of all, we've got that brilliant A-Series gearbox in sump whine in every gear in this car. That little gearbox whine is so sweet. And speaking of the gearbox, there's another thing carried over from the Mini Cooper in here, and that's the remote gear change. Now, early gearbox in sump A-Series cars, Minis, had what they called the magic wand, which was a gear lever that went straight into the bulkhead. it was vague and it wasn't that nice to use, to be honest. Traffic. Yet for the 1100 and of course the Mini Cooper and Mini Cooper S, they fitted it with the remote change, which kind of does as it says on the tin. But it is a little bit curious to use because while it's nowhere near as ponderous as the Magic Wand, it feels very vague in between the gate. It just feels as though there's nothing there until you find the gear. You find it and then it clicks home so satisfyingly. At first glance you think, oh my god, that's awful, but then you actually use it and it's just, oh, it just clicks so nice. As I said, it's such a torquey engine. You need to get used to the way to drive it because you don't need to be changing gear all the time. Of course, it has a 4-speed gearbox, as you'd expect, but you don't really need to use it because whatever conditions you're in, the engine will pull you through. That little A-Series is fantastic. Now, it's obvious why this car was called the 1100, but later on, they did get the option of 1275cc, which was badged as the 1300. And that made up to 70 brake horsepower in the Austin and Morris 1300 GT, which used a modified version of the Mini Cooper S engine. But that does naturally bring us onto the badging, because here's where things get confusing. This little car is probably the one that made BMC so famous for its badge engineering, because while we'd seen them do it before, it wasn't quite so blatant. Earlier this year we looked at the Wolseley 1500, a car that was essentially a revised and reclothed Morris Minor with a larger engine. Technically, this is badge engineering, but it's removed from the original car in more senses than one. This is essentially what Volkswagen does today between the Skodas and Audis, but the 1100's badge engineering was on such a basic level that the different versions were what we'd know today as trim levels. We started out with the Morris 1100 in 1962, joined the year after by the Austin, then an MG, a Wolseley, a Riley and a Vanden Plas, totaling 6 different names on the front of what were clearly the same car, and that's only in the UK. Theoretically, this could have worked, and it would be fair to say that, considering the 1100's success, it did work. But we know with hindsight that by fragmenting a car's image and marketing, it weakens the equity held in each name. And with BMC's ageing clientele, their image was no match for the likes of Ford. Additionally, the dealer network was fragmented, undoubtedly damaging BMC's ability to sell. Now, badge engineering is tricky. It's laden with so many caveats and research avenues that we just can't cover it in this video, but the headline is that the 1100 and 1300 range was messy at best. There's a reason the Mini became known simply as the Mini, and I think that's where we can get back on track, because these little cars weren't made by their transverse engine. Issigonis' thinking went much further than that, starting with the stance and the wheels. Back in the 1950s, cars tended to have quite large road wheels. So large, in fact, that they wouldn't look out of place in the 1990s, but big wheels are bad. Not only do they potentially knacker the ride quality, but big wheels means big wheel arches, which means less space for people inside the car. The Morris Minor, for example, had 14-inch wheels, but the Mini, in its chase for packaging supremacy, had 10s. The 1100 is one step up from that with 12s on it, but the philosophy is the same, and the stance is also the same, with the wheels pushed as far into each corner of the car as possible, which doesn't just do good for the packaging, but also makes Minis and 1100s infinitely more agile. You don't need me to tell you that Minis are famous for their agility and handling, and again, that's by design, and all within was carried straight over to the 1100. In this era, McPherson struts were just starting to become a force, while many manufacturers stuck with torsion bars and archaic leaf springs. Yet Issigonis decided to use double wishbones. Just about the best system possible. It's what Honda famously used for decades, and Porsche have just switched to it for the new 911 GT3. Minis and 1100s only use spindly little arms, but the geometry's there, while the rear is kept from dragging along the road with a set of trailing arms. But the key here isn't just the geometry, it's the springing. When designing the Mini, they ran out of time, fitting the car with efficient but firm rubber cones. The 1100, however, wouldn't see anything quite so vulgar, instead floating on fluid by virtue of hydroelastic suspension. Taking influence from Citroen's hydropneumatics, Hydrolastic shuns traditional springs in favour of 4 displacers, featuring rubber springs and pressurised fluid damping, linked through pipes front to back on each side, but independently side to side. It was designed to combine brilliant, floaty comfort with a surprising resistance to roll and simply incredible handling. But unlike Citroen's system, Hydrolastic was simple and reliable, and when slung under the 1100, it was nothing short of magnificent. Compared with their contemporaries, these things were spaceships. You and I have had the privilege of driving 4 Hydrolastic sprung cars on Twin Cam before, and they've all had slightly different characters. So the Mini was comfortable for a Mini, but it still kind of bounced along the road. It felt like Tigger to drive. Whereas the Land Crab, and even more so the Austin 3 litre, were very, very floaty. They were incredibly comfortable. In fact, the most comfortable cars I've ever been in, bar none, and they're cars from the 1960s. But they, although they handled well, they definitely bordered on towards luxury rather than handling like the Mini did. And the 1100, I'm very pleased to report, is just about in the middle of that, because I didn't show you when I was actually with the car before doing my main presentation, which is a shame, but I should have shown you how soft the suspension is. It's so nimble, this thing. It's so soft, it just kind of, you just press down on the wing and the whole car goes down to the ground, and then it comes back up. And you can feel that in the way it drives, because it has a little bit of the Mini's kind of Tiggerness to it. The Mini bounces along the road, the Mini bounces along the road, the Land Crab and 3 litre lollop along the road, and this does something kind of in between. It has a sense of bounciness, but when it does bounce, it then just floats back down. Speed bump, you can barely feel anything, and that's a big speed bump. Oh, clicky CV joint. No door mirrors. Speed bump again. It's Hydrolastic suspension is so good. It's incredibly good, and I don't understand how it had such a relatively short life, because although it was BMC's own technology, and I understand that, same thing happened with Citroen really, where not that many other manufacturers really started using it, but it's just such a lovely thing. It's so comfortable for such a tiny, tiny car. Oh yeah, rev matching again. Pedals are really nicely placed for heel and toe. Really nicely placed. So this car is not as direct as a Mini. It just isn't, but it still has that the sense of responsiveness as the Mini. It's not as sharp, but it has brilliantly responsive steering. But the body does roll, but that's not a bad thing. You know, body roll is not the end of the world at all. And if the car can cope with the body roll, then there's nothing wrong with it at all. And this car can do that spectacularly well. So if you were buying a car for the sake of performance, you'd go for a Mini. It's smaller, it's lighter, it does have crisper steering, but for actually using, and if you want a classic car to use all the time, and certainly back in the day, then I don't know why you wouldn't go for one of these. This is the thinking man's Mini. This is the sweet spot between the brilliant hydroelastic waftiness and the dartiness of the Mini. It's just such an enjoyable car to drive. It doesn't understeer either. It's so neutral in the way it's set up. And that remote change, when you get used to it, it just snicks from second to into the middle of the gate into third. This car is fantastic. Again, I sound like a total broken record here, but these hydroelastic cars, these Issigonis front drive cars, are just so good. They are ridiculously lovely to drive. I want one so badly. I just want to address the brakes actually, because they aren't something I'd usually address unless they were particularly noteworthy, but it's the first car I've ever driven, I think, that doesn't have a brake servo. I've driven Mark 1 Minis before, but they've been Cooper S's, which do have brake servos. So this 1100 is the first car I've driven without servo assistance, and what they say is true. The brake servo just damps out any feeling. The brakes in this car are more than good enough. You need to give them a little bit more of a shove, but it's worth it for that brilliant modulation you get from the pedal. It's such a fun car to drive. Hydroelastic is one of the unsung technological heroes, bringing Citroen's ideas into the mainstream and producing qualities that put many modern cars to shame. But as I briefly alluded to earlier, Hydroelastic only furthered Issigonis' pursuit for packaging supremacy. With no strut towers and the rear units tucked beneath the floor, this car is deceptively small. In fact, it's a similar size to the Volkswagen Up, yet this is a comfortable and spacious family car. It's not perfect with the characteristic upright steering column, but it hits every other target head on. The boot is like a cave, the legroom would suit a 5 Series, and best of all, it has pillows integrated into the pillars. That's without mentioning the ever so period porcelain green leather of this Wolseley, complete with a fabulously simple wood fascia, the jewelled warning lamps, blinking indicator stalk, and the fabulous strip speedometer. In many ways, the 1960s really were when the motor car peaked. And in support of that view, the public loved it too. I mentioned in the introduction that the Mini was never the best-selling car in Britain, and for the bulk of its life it hovered around the top 5, while its big brother chiselled its name into first place. Barring 1967, the 1100 was the best-selling car in Britain for every year it was in full series production between 1963 and 1970. And that's in spite of an onslaught from Ford consisting of the Anglia, the first 2 Cortinas and the Escort. It didn't disgrace itself overseas either, and so from an outsider's perspective, it seemed BMC could do no wrong. However, there was a storm brewing behind the scenes. The 1100 was never the most reliable of cars, and in spite of being the most popular, BMC couldn't build enough. Strike action was so frequent that there were always waiting lists, rather leading to that lull in 1967, and the updates including the 1300 engine came a little too late in the day to stem the tide of the opposition. We've already seen what went wrong with the Land Crab and later the Maxi, but worse was to come for the little cars thanks to the formation of British Leyland. BL was the result of BMC merging with Leyland, forming a manufacturing giant that lurched from one crisis to another, falling to bankruptcy in 1975. But back in '68, all eyes were on Ford, and the powers that be decided imitation was the best solution. The Issigonis front drive cars were expensive to build, so to chase conservatism and profit margins, BL launched the Morris Marina in 1971. It was as close as they could get to a Cortina clone, which replaced the Morris badged 1100s, and it didn't disgrace itself in terms of sales figures. But it couldn't match either the Blue Oval or the old car, and it terminally affected the firm's reputation. But the damage was only compounded in 1973 as the rest of the range was replaced by the Austin Allegro. Now fundamentally, the Allegro wasn't a bad car, but it failed to move the game on in any conceivable way. It still had its gearbox in the sump, it was still a saloon, and the less said about the shape, the better. By this point, Volkswagen was on the verge of launching the Golf, and Fiat was well into its stride with the 128, meaning that BMC's monumental technological lead had been left to wither away. When I make these videos, I don't usually continue on past a car's death, but with the 1100, I feel as though I have to. BMC went from total domination to relative failure within the space of 6 years. And that's an appalling shame because while we remember the Mini, the 1100 is almost lost to history. Next to no one under the age of 50 would even recognise one of these things. And that's a travesty because these things have such an important place in motoring history for codifying the Issigonis concept. And 60 years on, they're still spectacular to look at and spectacular to drive. The 1100 deserves all of our love. And on that note, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to support me that way, then please do follow the link in the description. And I'll have more videos coming along soon.